Hey, everybody, it's your friend Adam. I'm here with Tim O'Neill, author. He has a great blog about the historical content in the Bible. He's recently done a blog post criticizing a YouTuber we're all familiar with, Aaron Raw, on his understanding of the historical Jesus. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your book, Tim?
Sure. As you said, Tim O'Neill, my blog is historyforatheists.com. It's actually a bit broader than just critiquing some of the stuff that my fellow atheists get wrong about the history associated with the Bible. It's actually more about what many atheists, not all, get wrong about history generally. I should stress, despite rumours to the contrary, I am an atheist. I've been an atheist all my adult life. I've been an atheist since about the age of about 18 or 19. I forget exactly. And I believe in no God or gods. I do not believe that Jesus was Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I don't believe that he rose from the dead. I don't believe he was God in human form. I don't believe any of that stuff. But I suppose the reason I've written my blog, I've yet to write a book, but the blog is working kind of towards that. But the reason I started writing my blog is that I suppose in around about 2003, I discovered suddenly that atheism was almost cool. It was sort of like flavor of the month. Hitchens and Dawkins and Stenger and Harris and so on were bringing out books. There were articles about it in mainstream press, and so it went from being a topic that would pretty much kill the conversation at dinner parties to being the topic of conversation at dinner parties. And I thought this was pretty cool. Once I started to kind of engage with the so-called new atheism, which was this sort of new wave of atheist activism, I found that there was a lot that I was coming across in some of those books, but certainly in blogs and online forums that was talking about history and talking about the history of religion, the history of Christianity, and was getting it really badly wrong. And as someone who has studied history for about 30 plus years, I did a degree in history at university. I kept finding myself saying, well, actually, no, that's not right. And actually, that's a fringe theory that most historians don't accept. And actually, that's completely outdated. And historians haven't believed that for at least 100 years. And I found myself saying this over and over again about the same topics. So really, my blog was more an opportunity for me to save myself a bit of time. I got tired of saying the same stuff over and over again. So I thought, if I write a blog, write articles that basically comprehensively deal with these same few topics, then I'll just be able to link to those articles. So I was really sort of buying myself a bit more spare time because I'm a pretty busy sort of a guy. So that was the origin of History for Atheists. It has come to focus on a number of those topics, and one of those is the historicity of Jesus, because the mainstream consensus view of the overwhelming, and I mean overwhelming majority of scholars of all backgrounds, Christian, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, is that there was a historical Jesus as the point of origin of the latest stories about him. Now, that doesn't mean that all the latest stories about him are therefore true, and most of them probably aren't, I would argue, particularly the ones involving the supernatural. But we have plenty of supernatural stories about people that we know existed in the ancient world. So the fact that they were telling supernatural stories and making religious claims about him does not mean that he therefore didn't exist. But what I found is that, strangely, a disproportionate number of my fellow atheists started to buy into the Jesus myth thesis, which is the fringe thesis that there was no historical Jesus at all. Not just that the Jesus that we see depicted in the Gospels and the Jesus that is believed in by modern Christians didn't exist. So there wasn't a magic man who rose from the dead and flew off into the sky, but there was no man at all, and that he was a purely mythic figure that then became historicized, and people started depicting this mythic celestial or heavenly being doing things on earth when there was no such person. As I said, this is a fringe idea. It's held by about less than, about maybe 10 scholars of any kind, most of them pretty minor scholars in the whole world. And the overwhelming majority of scholars reject it. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong. And this is something I have to keep pointing out to people. I'm not making an argument from authority. The fact that most scholars reject it doesn't mean therefore it's wrong. But most scholars reject it because there are all sorts of problems with that thesis. And so what I try to do on my blog and elsewhere on my Twitter feed and so on is explain to people why that consensus is what it is. It's not because those guys are all, and girls are all brainwashed, or they're all Christians, because they're not. A great many of them aren't, including many leading scholars in the field. It's because the Jesus thesis, Jesus myth thesis, just has too many holes in it, is too contrived, and doesn't stand up to Occam's razor.
So you've definitely found a kindred spirit in me, because it's funny. I study moral psychology, and I was in the same exact boat with the new atheists, the anti-theist types, where they would be making moral claims that I kept finding problems with, because there are evolutionary explanations for the moral claims that they're fighting against. So I kept thinking, well, you're getting this wrong. And not only are you getting it wrong, but there's an evolutionary explanation for it. And you guys are standing under the banner of evolution. Like, you should know these arguments. These arguments should be second nature. So you're doing the same thing. You're kind of criticizing your own tribe because you want them to put the best arguments forward, I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting you use the word tribe, because what I find is that a lot of the criticism that I get for daring to question, the great Dawkins or the great Hitchens or any of these other guys, it feels quite tribal. It's like, well, you're meant to be on our side. And I even get people who regularly sort of try to insinuate that I'm not really an atheist because I don't believe in these other things that got nothing to do with atheism, like Jesus-mythicism. And it's very much about this sort of tribal feeling that, well, if you're not kind of 100% with all this stuff that we think, then you're obviously basically a Christian apologist. And I get that thrown at me all the time, which my friends find absolutely hilarious. People say, well, Tim O'Neill is a Christian triumphalist and a Christian apologist, which my friends just think is the funniest thing ever. Anyone who knows me knows that I am not.
It's kind of just par for the course these days, though. Like, if you give the other side a fair hearing, if you're just not willing to straw man their argument, then all of a sudden you are an apologist for their argument, which I'm one of the reasons why I started this channel is I'm trying to fight against that. So I've gotten in a few debates on this topic, on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. I think you and I probably are the same opinion that the supernatural stuff doesn't hold water. But in those debates, the question of whether or not Jesus actually lived did come up, and I am woefully unequipped to answer that. Right now, it is an open question for me. I went to your blog before we had this conversation, and you write some on the evidence for Jesus. Actually, I think you write more on the evidence the anti-theists are putting forward that Jesus never existed. They have this argument that you call the argument from silence. Do you want to outline that a little bit for us?
Yeah, okay. Well, an argument from silence is something that can legitimately be made in historical analysis. But the problem is you have to do it properly. And unfortunately, the Jesus-mythicists who use this argument from silence don't do that. So the way you make an argument from silence is not to simply note that a particular source or document is silent on a point, therefore that thing or person, that thing didn't happen. That's not enough. You have to show that document or source should have mentioned that particular element. So they should have mentioned that battle, mentioned that treaty, mentioned that person, yet it didn't. And this is where the mythicist attempt at the argument from silence fails. So what they do is they say, well, there are no contemporary references to Jesus, which is true. There aren't. and therefore he didn't exist. Now, that is a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that because there are no contemporary references to Jesus, he didn't exist, because we have no contemporary references to all kinds of things. We have no contemporary references in any literary source to the existence of Hannibal. Now, think about that. Hannibal was, for those who aren't clear, was a Carthaginian general, fought a major war, the Second Punic War, against the Roman Republic, when just before the Roman Empire was really getting off the ground and the Roman Republic was expanding through the Western Mediterranean. The Carthaginian Empire was expanding in the opposite direction, and they had a series of wars, which the Romans eventually won. Hannibal was the guy who almost brought the Roman Republic down. He definitely brought it to its knees, rampaged up and down Italy, defeating multiple Roman armies, and eventually, despite winning pretty much all the battles, somehow managed to lose the war. He was famous beyond famous. He was one of the most renowned ancient generals, up there with Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Everyone knew who Hannibal was. Yet how many literary references from his lifetime to him do we have? Zero. So for people to say, well, we have no contemporary references to Jesus, therefore he didn't exist, is completely ridiculous. Jesus was, everyone agrees, even the Christians agree, a pretty obscure Jewish preacher in a backwater part of the eastern end of the Roman Empire. For him to not be mentioned in contemporary sources makes absolute sense. It's not like he would have been hot news on the streets of Rome or Corinth or Alexandria. In fact, it's probably wasn't even hot news on the streets of Jerusalem, since he lived in a hick province to the north, up there in Galilee. So the claim that, well, we have no contemporary references to Jesus, therefore he didn't exist, doesn't make sense, simply because of the nature of our sources. We don't have contemporary references for about 85 to 90% of all ancient figures. Almost all of our sources, for almost everyone, with some fairly major and important exceptions, come from after their time. That's simply because of the nature of our sources. It's very fragmentary. We have very few sources for anyone, and very few of them are actually contemporary. And the other problem with the idea of, well, there's no contemporary sources for Jesus, the yardstick by which we measure whether or not we should have contemporary sources for someone is we look at analogous figures. So we look at other people like Jesus and say, do we have contemporary sources for these guys? So I have people saying, well, look, we've got contemporary sources for Julius Caesar. Why don't we have them for Jesus? Well, that's because Julius Caesar was ruler of the entire Roman world. He was an extremely important guy. So that's like saying, we have contemporary sources for President Obama, but we don't have one for for Dave who lives down the street. So why not? It's because President Obama is a bit more important. So that's not comparing apples to apples. If we compare apples to apples and we look at other early first century Jewish preachers, prophets, messianic claimants, other people like Jesus, we find that we have no contemporary sources for any of them. For all of them, like Jesus, we have some references decades later. And that's exactly what we find for Jesus. So this argument has no force. It's actually such a bad argument that even some of the most prominent Jesus-mythicists, so people like Richard Carrier and Robert Price, don't use it because they know that it's a stupid argument. Yet, unfortunately, I come across it all the time. And a lot of people seem to think it's a slam dunk argument. And it simply isn't. It's a terrible argument, which anyone with any training in the historical method would recognize as being terrible. And I think it's symptomatic that many people who accept mythicism find this a powerful argument. It just shows that mythicism is largely supported by people who really don't understand history and how history is studied.
Well, I'm definitely one of those people, but I'm glad you're here to give me an education on it. So the two questions that I have, and maybe you can lay them out separately, are what is the best evidence for these historical claims, specifically the historical life of Jesus, and what is the best evidence that the mythicists have? Now, I know Richard Carey, you've mentioned. I've seen some of Richard Carey's talks. he definitely feels like he has an axe to grind. Like he feels like an anti-theist. So I might accuse him of a bit of motivated reasoning, a bit of confirmation
Yeah,
bias. So, but
yeah. I think you could be safe in saying that.
but you don't you seem to be open to the fact that this could go either way. Do you have a position? Are you like 90% one way
Oh
or
yeah,
10%?
yeah. I do, no, I do have a position,
Okay.
and I think that's a very good question because a lot of people get very sort of fundamentalist about this. It's either one thing or the other. Either you can prove that Jesus definitely existed, and if you can't prove it, then the only answer is that he didn't. And history doesn't work like that. I've literally just come from a kind of a Twitter exchange with someone who was saying, you can't definitively prove it, to which I would sort of say, well, I can't definitively prove pretty much anything in pre-modern history. History is not like science. History is a humanities discipline, and it is based not on empirical proof. It's based on assessments of what is most likely. So what a historian does, because we don't have a time machine, so we can't go back in time and observe the past. The past happens and then is gone, but it leaves breadcrumbs. So it leaves a trail of evidence, if we're lucky. It leaves a trail of evidence. And what historians do is they act like detectives. They go back and they look at that breadcrumb trail and try to determine what is most likely to have happened. And sometimes they can't say much more than, it seems as though this happened. So what a historian does is makes an assessment of likelihood. It's a subjective assessment, but it's a structured and evidence-based one. So it's not like historians just can pluck anything out of the air and just go, oh, well, I think this happened. They have to actually base it on evidence. And then what historians have to do is they have to make an argument to the best explanation that says, here is why it looks like this is what happened. And they try and convince their peers. And that's why consensus, getting back to that point about how most scholars accept that Jesus existed, that's why consensus is actually quite powerful and important in the study of history. Because if you've convinced a large number of your historical peers, your historian peers, that your argument as to what is most likely to have happened makes the most sense, then that actually carries some weight. It doesn't mean that you're automatically right. And anyone who wants definitive, definite, hard and fast, empirically based answers, I'm sorry, there's the door. The sciences are that way. History isn't like that. So do I have a position? Absolutely. I don't care if Jesus didn't exist. I don't care. It makes no difference to me whatsoever. The Jesus that I say, the historical Jesus that I think is most likely to have existed, and conclude is most likely to have existed, was a Jewish apocalyptic prophet who thought that the end of the world was coming very soon in his lifetime, was wrong, and got crucified and died. Now, it doesn't matter one bit to me whether that guy existed or not, but I think it's most likely that he did. The reason I do have a position, though, is that what you tend to do in historical analysis is you look at the alternative explanations and you weigh them up and you work out which one makes the most sense, is most parsimonious, is most likely to pass the test of Occam's razor, requires the least number of convoluted ad hoc explanations and suppositions, and which one doesn't. And in this case, the idea that there was a Jewish preacher who pretty much went and preached the coming end of the world and got crucified and died, and then became the center of a Jewish sect, which turned into a cult, which turned into a world religion. That makes most sense. Whereas the mythicist alternative, in order to deal with the evidence that we have, the source material and the references that we have, has to resort to a whole lot of very convoluted explanations, readings, different alternative ideas, most of which are based on hypotheticals and suppositions. It doesn't stand up to Occam's razor. So, lots of mythicists have got answers to every single problem that people put to them. They're just not very good answers. They're highly contrived answers, and they don't convince most people, apart from people who have got an emotional investment in the idea that Jesus didn't exist. And I think Richard Carrier is a guy who does have that emotional investment. He says he doesn't, but everyone says that. But it's pretty clear that he spent, the best part of a decade of his life and has written a thumping great book arguing for this stuff. He's staked his entire career, such as it is, on this idea. He's not going to back down. He's also not a guy who's renowned for backing down. So to get back to your question, what do I think is the best, what's the key reasons I think it's most likely he existed? There's a couple of answers to that question. The first one is we have absolutely no account of the origins of Christianity that doesn't go back to there was this guy called Jesus or this guy called Christus. None. So there's no alternative versions. There's no alternative options as to the origins of Christianity, whereby Christianity arises out of a purely celestial Jesus, a purely mythic Jesus, and then that gets historicized, which is what the mythicists claim. There is no evidence that there was such an alternative version of Christianity at the beginning. That's pure supposition. So all of the evidence that we have, and when I'm talking about evidence, I'm talking about the source material that we analyze in order to answer the question about what is most likely to have happened. All of the evidence we have says it began with this dude. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it did, but it means that there's already a strong a priori case that says that's probably what happened. Because usually when people say it happened like this, it's usually because it happened like that. Whereas mythicism is based on the idea that there must have been an alternative, a proto-Christianity that believed in a purely mythic Jesus who was a celestial figure. They started telling stories about him on earth. Then they forgot somehow that it was all originally a celestial guy. The historical stories took hold. There's a whole string of suppositions there that for which there is no historical basis. They try very, very hard to say, well, maybe this text, the Ascension of Isaiah, is actually talking about a celestial Jesus who doesn't come to earth, despite the fact that it actually does have a bit where he does come to earth. That's a later addition. It's supposition based on supposition, piled on top of each other. Whereas the alternative that they said, well, there was a dude, therefore there was a dude, actually just makes perfect sense. But there's more to it than that, because there's also elements in the stories about Jesus that we have, which are a bit weird and a bit awkward, but only makes sense, only really makes sense if what they are is historical elements that they couldn't leave out of the Jesus story, despite the fact that they were a bit awkward. So I'll give you one example. I'm writing an article about this one at the moment. One bit that pretty much everyone on the planet knows about Jesus is that he was Jesus of Nazareth. Right, so he came from Nazareth. And we've all heard the Christmas story. It's on all the Christmas cards. You know, he went from Nazareth and got born in a manger in Bethlehem, and then he grew up in Nazareth. So Jesus is, called Jesus of Nazareth. He's called the Nazarene. The early Christian sect were quite often called Nazarenes as a result. All of the Gospels depict him as coming from Nazareth. The interesting thing about the Nazareth element is not just that it's consistent across all of the early traditions about Jesus and is found in all of the Gospels without exception. The interesting thing about Nazareth is that the Nazareth thing was a bit awkward. So there's one part in the Gospel of John where one of the disciples has just met Jesus right at the beginning and goes to his friend Nathaniel and says, "We've found the Messiah, the one spoken of by Moses. He's Jesus from Nazareth." And Nathaniel replies, "What good could come from Nazareth?" And so he's quite dismissive of the idea that Jesus was the Messiah purely because he's from Nazareth. Later in the same gospel, in chapter 7, there are lots of people having a debate about who Jesus was. And some people are saying he's the Messiah, and other people are saying, well, he can't be the Messiah. He's from Galilee, he's from Nazareth in Galilee. The Messiah is meant to be from Bethlehem. And this is because there was a prophecy or a passage in the prophet Micah, which said that the Messiah was interpreted as saying that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, which was the town of King David. And so these people are depicted in the Gospel of John as objecting to the idea that Jesus was the Messiah purely on the basis that he's from the wrong town. And Nathaniel is depicted as rejecting the idea that Jesus was anything special because he was from this crappy little one-donkey town called Nazareth. So what we're finding in the gospel traditions is that they're having to deal with this rather awkward fact that the guy was from the wrong town. The Messiah was meant to be from Bethlehem, that's in Judea, but this guy was known to be from Nazareth, which is about 2 days or 3 days walk north in Galilee. So what we're finding in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew is some very complicated stories that explain how someone who was from Nazareth came to just happen to be born in the right town, Bethlehem. So they're saying, oh, no, yeah, he's from Nazareth, sure, but he happened to be born in Bethlehem because, in Luke's version, because they had to go there because of the census. Right? So we know that from the Christmas story. They had to go to Bethlehem because of the census, and while they were there, he was born there, so he was born in the right town, but then they went home to Nazareth. The only problem is in the Gospel of Matthew, we get a different story, and that story, they start in Bethlehem. That's where they live. He's born in their house there in Bethlehem, but they have to leave because King Herod wants to kill the Messiah. So they go to Egypt, and then when they come back, they settle in Nazareth. Both of them are doing the same thing. They're telling a story about how a guy from Nazareth just happened to be born in Bethlehem. But the problem is they're contradicting each other. So what they're doing is they're making up stories. It's clear that stories are being developed that explain away this awkward fact that he's from Nazareth and explain how he actually did fit with the prophecies. Why is this happening? It seems to be happening because he was from Nazareth. He was from the wrong town, and they had to come up with ways to make him fit the theology. This indicates that the historical kernel of Nazareth is real. All that makes perfect sense if we're talking about a historical guy who was from Nazareth. They're trying to shoehorn him into the theology. If we turn to the mythicist alternative, the question is, why the hell is Nazareth in the stories? Nazareth doesn't have any theological significance. Nazareth doesn't fit with the claims they're making about him being the Messiah. So why did they create a problem by depicting him in Nazareth and then go to all this effort, tripping each other up, of depicting him being born in Bethlehem? Why isn't he, if he's a mythic Jesus of Bethlehem? Why is Nazareth in the story at all? I've yet to come across a mythicist who can give me an answer to that wasn't riddled with bullshit.
Right. So your argument, just to encapsulate it, is that the historical Jesus had this biographical problem that they were trying to get around, that if it was just a mythical story that they were creating from whole cloth, then there wouldn't be the actual biography that they would have the problem with, because they'd just be making it up.
Exactly, more or less. I mean, I wouldn't argue that, and mythicists generally don't say that they were making it all up. Mm-hmm. But what they were saying is that it kind of evolved out of earlier ideas about a non-historical figure, a mythic figure, right, that was conforming to the theology. But it still doesn't work. If that was the case, then and it was conforming to the theology, then it would fit the theology better. And that example of Nazareth and the fact that Nazareth was a major problem for the gospel writers is just one of about 4 or 5 similar types of problems that we find. There are other elements in the story that, again, don't make a lot of sense unless they are historical elements that the gospel writers were trying to retrofit to fit their theology. So all of the gospels, again, one of the elements that all of the gospels have is Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. And the issue there is you got baptized by someone who was spiritually superior to you. And this is a bit awkward for the gospel writers because Jesus is meant to be at least the Messiah, the anointed one of God, or in the Gospel of John, actually probably God in human form. So why is he being baptized by John? Why is he having his sins forgiven by John if John was somehow lesser than him? This isn't a problem in the first gospel, the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, because that gospel doesn't seem to be depicting Jesus as being Messiah from birth or from the beginning of time. In that gospel, he becomes Messiah at that point. So he's an ordinary dude. He goes down to the River Jordan. He gets baptized by John. The heavens open. Jesus sees, no one else sees, a dove descending and a voice saying, "You are my son with whom I'm well pleased." Then he goes off into the desert and meditates and has conversations with Satan, and then comes back and starts preaching. So at that point in the Gospel of Matthew, he becomes the Messiah. So it's not a problem that before that he was just an ordinary dude being baptized like everyone else. It becomes a problem, though, in the later Gospels. So in the Gospel of Luke, the writer of Luke has to introduce an earlier story about Jesus Jesus' mother and John the Baptist's mother meeting each other when they were both pregnant, and John the Baptist leaping in the womb and acknowledging Jesus as his superior. So that's Luke's fairly subtle way of getting around the problem that Jesus seems to be being baptized and having his sins forgiven by a subordinate. Matthew's writer is much less subtle. So Matthew's writer introduces a bit of dialogue. He's using Mark, by the way, as his source, but he introduces a bit of dialogue where John the Baptist says, I shouldn't be baptizing you, you should be baptizing me. And Jesus said, no, it's okay, right? So, and then John's gospel gets around the problem by taking away the baptism altogether. There is no baptism in John. In John's gospel, John the Baptist is saying the Messiah will come, he's coming any day now, and then says, oh, look, there he is over there, and Jesus turns up. There's no baptism, he takes it out. So it seems that with these three gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, the baptism element is awkward because it doesn't fit their theology, which raises the question, why is it there? I mean, it's not there in John, he gets rid of it, but why do they have this encounter between Jesus and John the Baptist? And again, it seems to be that this was something that actually happened. It seems to be that Jesus was an ordinary dude who went and got baptized like everyone else, had a spiritual experience, went out into the desert, came back convinced that he was a prophet, and took up where John had left off because John had been arrested. That part of the story does actually hang together. Again, I've asked mythicists, why is this thing in the story? They can't give me very good answers. It makes most sense that it's in the story, and they have to deal with it in these very awkward ways because they couldn't pretend it didn't happen because it did. And those are two examples of about five that seem to indicate that there's a historical kernel in it.
Well, I like this Jesus, just as from my point of view, I like the idea of the apocalyptic preacher, and from a psychology perspective, I mean, we've seen that in our lifetime. Like that's an archetype that pops up every 10 years. So the idea that this kind of thing couldn't have taken place, it seems like a very reasonable story, and the story that you're laying out here seems very reasonable too. I want to get into some of the pushback that the skeptics will give, because a lot of what you're saying is based out of the Bible. Now, these sources, obviously the Bible is comprised of many, many different sources, but when you're building a historical case, I like that you're appealing to parsimony. You're saying the easiest explanation is that this guy just was what we see in our modern society. His preaching made an impact, like more than most, and the stories took on a life of their own afterwards. Obviously, there's been some changes along the way, which makes complete and utter sense. But a lot of the skeptics will say that that it's only based on the Bible, that there's no other sources that put this narrative forward. So what is your response to things like that?
Okay, so first of all, sometimes I do get this response. It's not a very good response, but I get it quite often. In fact, I got it just this morning on Twitter. They say, well, you're using the Bible to prove the Bible.
Yes.
First of all, the Bible isn't a book. The Bible is a collection of ancient texts. It was collected a good 300 years after the fact, and most of these ancient texts, the people writing them didn't consider them to be like the word of God. Paul was just writing letters to people. You know, he didn't even regard them to be sort of letters about theology, but they were just letters. And we got, say hello to Dave, and could you send that cloak that I left at Bob's place? He's actually writing stuff like this. Send it back to me. I left it behind. So the Bible is just a collection of ancient documents, which means it can be used. They can be used like any other ancient documents. No historian picks up, say, Suetonius's book, The 12 Caesars, and reads, then Julius Caesar did this, and thinks, oh, well, that's what happened. But what they do is they subject it to critical analysis. So when it says Caesar then did this, and they compare it to other sources, and other sources say that he did something different, then the historian needs to make that parsimoniously based assessment of what is most likely based on the evidence. When Suetonius says, and then Caesar was seen to ascend into the heavens after his assassination, well, a historian can read that and go, well, that's probably what people like Suetonius believe. that doesn't mean that's what happened. So we can do the same with the books in the Bible. In the Gospels, for example, when it says Jesus went from Nazareth to Capernaum, then there's nothing to say that may or may not have happened, but there's nothing outrageous about the idea of a guy walking from one town to another town. When it says that Jesus levitated into the air and his face shone like the sun, it's unlikely that that bit actually happened. So historians are doing exactly the same thing. What we're doing, though, when we're looking at, let's say, the gospel account of Jesus' baptism, is we're not saying, there it is in the Gospels, therefore it happened. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, what are the gospel writers doing with this? And what does that tell us about what is likely to have happened? What are the possible origins of these stories? Some of them are almost certainly not historical origins. Jesus flying up into the air and his face shining like the sun, talking to Moses and Elijah. Pretty sure that didn't happen. But others do seem to have elements in them that indicate that they are historical. And I've just given you a couple of examples. So what we're doing with, as critical scholars, what we're doing with the Gospels is using them in the same way that ancient historians use any ancient source. And ancient sources are full of supernatural stuff. There's talking statues and, portents from the heavens and, things falling out of the sky and stuff happening all the time, visions happening all the time. So the fact that there's that stuff in the Gospels doesn't rule the Gospels out. The fact that the Gospels were later gathered together and elevated to the status of sacred scripture and are now bound together in this single volume that people call the Holy Bible is irrelevant as well. That'll happen centuries later. We just look at them as they are, which is ancient documents, and we look at them skeptically and critically and apply the same principles of historical analysis that we apply to any ancient text.
So those principles,
does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Those principles of historical analysis are basically reading a wide variety of documents. Well, reading really anything that you can get your hands on, right? And then developing a case where they are corroborating each other's stories, right? And like interlinking them, so to speak.
Sort of. You try to read them in context. And so you're constantly asking questions about your sources. Where did they get this information? We usually don't know, but we can try and get an idea of where they would be getting their information from. What's their perspective on this? What axes do they have to grind? What are their biases? What is their objective in writing this text? People didn't write objective documentary history in the ancient world. They always had an agenda. Who was their audience? What did their audience know? What did they assume that their audience may have known? What are they telling their audience that tells us what their audience may not have known? So these are the questions that we're asking about any ancient source. This is what historians do. This is what their bread and butter is. And this is what you're trained when you do a degree in history. This is what you're trained to do. And I think a lot of people who look at how scholars analyze the Gospels, a lot of them who are coming from a former Christian background, many of them who are coming from a fundamentalist Christian background, get very confused. And they think that historians and critical scholars are doing with the Gospels what Christian preachers do, which is basically just accepting it out on faith. No historian, no scholar does that. Certainly not the critical and more progressive ones. Maybe some of the conservative ones do it without sort of meaning to do so. So back to your question though about there's no other references to Jesus outside of the Gospels. Well, actually there are. There are at least two that are actually reasonably solid, and these are ones that people get very agitated about. But one of them is Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, Joseph ben Mattaniyahu, and the other is the Roman historian I mentioned earlier, Cornelius Tacitus. Now, the Josephus mention is contentious because there are actually two mentions of Jesus in Josephus's book, The Antiquities of the Jews. The first of them is in book 18, and that's what's often referred to as the Testimonium Flavianum. And that is a whole paragraph, not a long one, but a whole paragraph talking about Jesus, says who he was, talks about him being executed, says that his followers still exist. The problem with that is that it has clearly been doctored by Christian scribes. And so they have added elements to it. So the testimonium says things like, in this time there was a wise man called Jesus, if indeed it be lawful to call him a man, for he was the Christ. Well, it's pretty obvious that Josephus, who was a devout Jew, did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah and believed he was the Christ.
So
that
is
bit's
the question there that they added all of it in because they obviously doctored it up? That leads to the idea that maybe like it wasn't Josephus at all.
Yeah, that's the question, and there are whole shelves of books on that very question, because there are certainly elements, such as he was the Christ, he was the Messiah, and also and he rose from the dead on the third day. Well, Josephus didn't write that. So then the question becomes, as you quite correctly pointed out, is the whole passage a wholesale interpolation, or was there an original mention of Jesus at this point in Book 18? And they just came along and added a couple of bits to spice it up. Opinion is divided on this among Josephus scholars. A majority of Josephus scholars currently believe that it is partially authentic. So there is a majority position that there was an original mention of Jesus. It was actually reasonably close to what we have in the text, and what was added was just the bits about him being the Messiah and him rising from the dead, and maybe some bits about him performing miracles. So that's the majority position. There is a minority, but very solid and academically respectable position that it's a wholesale interpolation. And both sides have got very good arguments.
Is there any way to settle it? Is there any?
No.
Okay.
It's an absolute moot point. But I think this is the important thing to remember. Mythicists try to argue and often claim, like outright, it's been proven to be a wholesale forgery. Well, It hasn't.
Yeah.
But there are arguments on both sides, and there are counter arguments against the arguments, and then there are counter arguments to the counter arguments. It's a moot point, and we will never, unless we find a new manuscript that dates back to the 1st century that's got the passage in it without the adulterations. And I wake up every morning hoping that we will, because historians love that stuff. But until that happens, and that's unlikely, we're never going to settle whether the testimonium is a wholesale forgery or partially authentic. I'm inclined towards partial authenticity for a number of reasons, but I wouldn't die in a ditch over it. And so as a result, I don't hold up the Testimonium Flavianum, the Book 18 reference, up as anything significant. I simply say it's a moot point, there's good arguments on either side, and put it to one side. But there's a second reference to Jesus in Josephus, and that's in Book 20, and it's a very different sort of thing. In Book 20, Josephus is talking about something that happened while he was in Jerusalem. He lived in Jerusalem, and it happened while Josephus, was 26 years old. So what happened in the year 62 AD was the Roman prefect, so the Roman governor or procurator of Judea, died while he was in office. So there was no Roman ruler in Judea at that point. The new one was on his way out from Rome, and that took quite a bit of time, took several months to get there. In the meantime, the high priest, Hanan ben Hanan, had some people illegally executed. So he had some people condemned to death, and some other people, other Jews, objected to this because it was illegal and appealed to the Romans. The new Roman governor then had the high priest deposed. Right now, this is a significant event. It was like it's like having a prime minister or president impeached, and Josephus was in Jerusalem at the time. Was a member of the priestly caste, so was a member of the priestly family himself, would have been paying very close attention to this event. It was a major political upheaval in his, at the beginning of his political career. He had just come back from Rome himself, where he'd led an embassy to the Roman Senate. Now, the significance of this passage is that he mentions in passing, when he talks about these illegal executions, that they included the brother of that Jesus who was called Messiah, named James. And we know from other sources, including the Gospels, that Jesus had brothers, and that one of these brothers was called James. And we know from early Christian sources, including the book of Acts, that James was a leader of the Christian the early Christian sect, the Jesus sect in Jerusalem. And we know from other early Christian sources that James was executed by the high priests in Jerusalem before the Jewish rebellion against the Romans in 66 AD. So it all matches up that it's, guess who? It's James, the brother of Jesus. This is not some guy on the other side of the Roman Empire talking about hearsay. This is a guy who was there and who is telling us another story. He's telling us about the deposition of Hanan ben Hanan, but he mentions, and it was triggered by the execution of this guy, James, brother of Jesus. So that's pretty solid.
What do we know about Josephus? You're saying Josephus was at the execution of Jesus, or his brother later on when he was 26 years old?
We don't know if he was there, but he was in Jerusalem. He lived in Jerusalem. He was either in the city at the time, or he came back very soon afterwards. He'd just come back from that embassy to Rome. We know this because he wrote a short autobiography.
And so Josephus was a contemporary of Jesus, you're saying?
He was a contemporary of Jesus' brother.
Oh, Jesus' brother. But we don't know how old
so
the brother
Jesus'
was.
brother probably would have been an older man at that stage, probably would have been in his 60s.
Okay, I got you.
Whereas Josephus was probably born just after Jesus' execution. Remember, keep in mind, Jesus was probably executed as a fairly young man. So he was a younger contemporary of Jesus' brother James.
So there's these there's these two Josephus references. You mentioned also Tacitus.
Yeah, Tacitus is probably a little bit more removed because Tacitus is writing in the early 2nd century, so probably about 114 AD. So that's about sort of 90 years after, or 80 or 90 years after the time of Jesus. But he tells the story of that we know from other sources of the Great Fire of Rome. And what happened there was that an enormous fire took hold in Rome, destroyed a large part of the city and caused an enormous hardship. And it was blamed on the Emperor Nero because he was very unpopular, and rumor had it that he wanted to clear a large section of the city of Rome to build a new palace. And so he was in political trouble, and so he tried to shift the blame. He scapegoated the Christians. And what Tacitus says, he stops to explain why this little sect that he scapegoated were called Christians. And he says that they were named after this guy called Christus, who was executed in Judea by Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. So he stops in his story to sort of say, this is why they're called Christians. They're named after this guy. He was a troublemaker. He was executed in a particular place. So we've got where, at a particular time, the reign of Tiberius. So we've got when, and we've got and by Pontius Pilate. We've got who. That's pretty straightforward. Tacitus is a hostile witness because Tacitus hated Christianity. He refers to it as a most mischievous superstition with a hatred for mankind. He did not like Christianity, and he depicts Jesus as a troublemaker who was rightly executed, and then says, but this vileness sprung up again, despite the fact that it had been dealt with back then. So this is a fairly terse, not very friendly reference to Jesus as a historical person by probably one of the most careful and skeptical Roman historians that we have. Now, the way mythicists try to deal with this is they try several attempts. I've got an article on this on my blog. One way they try to deal with this, they say, oh, he's just repeating what Christians said about Jesus. Well, actually, nothing in what he says is repeating Christian claims. There's nothing about his teaching. There's nothing about his miracles. There's nothing about him rising from the dead. It's purely he was a troublemaker who got executed, and rightly so. The other thing they try to do is and they always try and do this with any evidence that doesn't fit their thesis, they say it's an interpolation. It's been added by Christian scribes. Well, there's all kinds of problems with that, largely because Christian scribes tended to, when they did add stuff, they tried to make their guy sound good. And in this case, it's a very hostile account that makes their guy sound pretty bad. It's very unlikely that was added by a Christian scribe. It's also in a distinctively Tacitian style. He had a very distinctive style of Latin, and a 4th or 5th century Christian scribe would have found it very difficult to emulate that style. As a result, pretty much no Tacitus scholars believe that this is an interpolation. So what we've got is a very terse and hostile, but quite rigorous historian saying Christianity was founded by this guy. And it was at this time in this place, which matches up with the other stuff that we know.
Well, this is fascinating stuff, and I'm glad you're giving me kind of a background here so I don't wander into these debates with all this atheist bluster. You recently called out Aaron Ra on your blog. Aaron Ra had made some claims that rubbed you the wrong way. Can you lay out a bit of that background? Like give us the drama. What exactly happened here?
Well, I've kind of had to go and sort of sink the boots into him a couple of times. He's one of these guys who's I think is pretty typical of the stuff of the kind of person that my blog is trying to correct. He's a guy I gather with a science background. I think he's a paleontologist. Correct me if I'm wrong. He is like many people, many right-thinking people. He thinks creationism is nonsense because it is. And so he's
we agree with him there, right?
Well, we agree with him there. I also agree with him that the sky's blue. Yeah, so he's like a lot of people like Dawkins and so on. They kind of got into this sort of anti-theism thing via countering creationism, and so as a result, I've watched his videos on creationism and evolution. And look, I'm no scientist, but I did my time countering creationists until I realized it was completely freaking pointless. So I'm reasonably familiar with that stuff, and what he's saying makes a lot of sense. The problem is that he seems to have got this idea in his head that he's now an expert on everything. And when he strays onto history, the results are disastrously bad. He really is terrible. So he has written a couple of things on the idea of Jesus-mythicism, and he clearly does not have a clue. He's read a few things that he kind of likes the sound of, and so he just parrots that stuff. And when you poke at him, he just sort of backs away. He doesn't even bother to defend it. But he doesn't back down. He doesn't say, "Oh, well, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about." But more recently, I came across a video where he was arguing that Christianity has stifled science down through the ages, and he had about a 15-minute lecture. It was in a debate in a church in Texas about where he was making all sorts of claims about the history of science and Christianity, and every single claim he made was wrong. It was astonishing. I mean, if he was trying to get things completely wrong as a way of undermining atheism and making atheists look stupid, he couldn't have done a better job. It was absolutely astounding. And I had several people, this is just in April this year, I had several people send me this video and go, "Look at this." And I just couldn't let it pass. I had to write an article on it. So what I do in this article is I basically take line by line every statement that he makes, and then in some detail explain what he's gotten wrong. Just to give you one example, he claims that the church in the late antiquity and in the Middle Ages taught that the earth was flat because the Bible said that the earth was flat. That's wrong. The church did not teach that. The church had worked out very early on that the biblical references that clearly are to a flat earth could be interpreted and should be interpreted symbolically, allegorically, and not literally. And this is because some of the early church intellectuals were well versed in ancient Greek science and natural philosophy, and so knew the arguments, knew the evidence that showed that the earth is actually round. So they'd sorted that out long before the Middle Ages. The idea that the church in the Middle Ages taught that the earth was flat is a 19th century myth. And I had thought that it was slowly starting to filter into common knowledge that it is a myth and that the medieval church did not teach that the earth was flat. But it appears that hasn't filtered all the way to Texas because Aaron Ra still seems to believe that the medieval church taught that the earth was flat. And it's just dead wrong. If you open up any medieval textbook on cosmology, what you find are the arguments straight from Aristotle that show that the earth is round. When Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the enormous theological textbook in the 13th century, the Summa Theologica, right at the beginning of that book, where he wanted to give an example of an objective scientific fact that everyone agreed with, he picked the idea that the earth was round. We even have medieval folk tales about a guy who walked into the east and traveled so far that he ended up coming back to his home from the west, which only makes sense if everyone understood that the earth was round. And we have depictions in churches of Jesus holding a globe in his hand. Everyone knew that the earth was frigging round, yet Aaron Ra doesn't seem to have grasped that. There is actually a very good book on the whole topic called Inventing the Flat Earth, which is, it's not a very thick book, but it's by Jeffrey Burton Russell, and he basically takes how the myth arose, and it largely, unfortunately, we can blame you Americans, it largely arose out of some founding myths about Christopher Columbus, and then permeated your public school system in the 19th century, and so is still widely promulgated. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who you would think would be a guy who checks his facts, is still on Twitter, still talking about how the idea that the earth was flat was being taught by the church in the Dark Ages, which is complete crap. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and when he gets corrected on it, he just brushes it aside because, he's a science dude and he knows everything.
Wow.
That guy's a bit of a dick, by the way.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, that's funny. Well, the anti-theists that I encounter, just from the moral psychology perspective, I mean, they're very much trying to establish a narrative. They have a central premise that religion is evil, and this is an argument that they like to put towards that premise. If religion is holding back our scientific advancements, it goes to that narrative that religion is evil. But like, as you say, I mean, I can think of 3 guys off the top of my head that the church financed, like Copernicus, Mendel with his genetics, Newton was an avid Christian. So, I mean,
well, this is referred to as the conflict thesis. It's also known as the Draper-White thesis. So Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper were 2 American writers. They weren't historians in the late 19th century. And they were vehemently anti-Christian, in particular, particularly anti-Catholic, and were writing in the wake of the controversy over Darwinian evolution. And so what they did was they sort of took that conflict, which is real. There was definitely and is an ongoing conflict between some forms of Christianity, not all, but some very conservative forms of Christianity and science on that particular issue. But they took that and then projected it back over the whole of Western history to try to argue that there has always been this conflict. Unfortunately, they were wrong, and so a lot of the stuff that they used as their evidence is distorted, is misinterpreted, or is in some cases just made up. The Draper-White thesis has been rejected by historians of science for about 100 years. So it's a bit ridiculous that people like, unfortunately, Sam Harris, the people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and people like Aaron Ra continue to perpetuate it. So there's a recent book actually on the history of that historical question, the warfare between science and religion, the idea that wouldn't die. And this is a collection of essays by some of the leading historians of science working in the world today on why the conflict thesis is wrong, but more interestingly, why it's permeated our popular conceptions of history, and why even when you show people that it's wrong, they resist it. So you just mentioned Copernicus, for example. Aaron Ra in that video that I debunked held up Copernicus as an example of the church holding back science.
What?
Oh yeah. Well, because when the Galileo affair, which was more about theology and politics than it was about science, but anyway, when the Galileo affair happened in the early 1600s, part of the fallout from that political and theological struggle was that Copernicus's books weren't allowed to be published without correction. Right? They weren't banned, but they weren't allowed to be published without some notes in the margin saying, he's saying this is fact, this bit's actually only theory, which at that time was true, by the way.
Mhm.
But Copernicus himself not only had no trouble with the church at all, but was sponsored by a bishop, Bishop Tiedemann of Ulm, was encouraged by the Pope. The Pope had a public lecture in the Vatican Gardens by one of Copernicus's pupils, Johann Wittgenstein. And the Pope, 3 cardinals, the papal physician, and the rest of the papal court sat there in the garden, drinking wine on a summer evening, and afterwards were delighted by the whole idea. Thought the concept was fascinating. And later on, one of the cardinals who heard about that wrote to Copernicus saying, apparently you're writing a great big thick book on this. Anything I can do to help you, I'll do. If you want me to send you some money to send me produce a copy that I can read. So these guys were fascinated by it. They were not trying to shut him down. What happened though is when Copernicus's final book was released, just in the year in which he died, people read the book and actually found that there were some still quite serious scientific objections to the idea of heliocentrism. And that's because the Copernican model is mostly wrong. It's right about the sun being at the center. It's wrong about everything else. So not surprisingly, there are major scientific problems with it. And these were recognized straight away. People worked out that Copernicus's model was good as a calculating device, pretty good in some cases, but that's what it was mainly used for. It wasn't until Kepler came along and then Kepler's physics was then further supported by Newton that the tide really turned in favor of heliocentrism. In Galileo's time, there was probably 5 or 6 people in the whole of Europe who accepted heliocentrism, who accepted Copernican heliocentrism. The overwhelming majority of scientists, astronomers, natural philosophers, thought that Galileo was wrong. And so the church didn't sort of say, well, we're rejecting the scientific consensus. The church actually said, and made it quite clear, we've checked with the scientists. They say you're wrong. So here's the theological implications of that. You can't go around interpreting the Bible on the basis of this scientific idea that everyone says is absurd in philosophy, in other words, scientifically wrong, which changes the whole conception. The church had the science on its side. It's just that the science changed about 80 years later. So everyone's sort of saying, well, bad church for being wrong. Well, they couldn't help it. That was what the scientific consensus was. But it's easy for us to be wise in hindsight. And Galileo was wrong about pretty much everything as well. He thought that the orbits of the planets were circular and that there was these various sort of epicycles and that the tides were caused by the Earth's rotation. All totally wrong, and all could be seen to be wrong at the time. But he was a very stubborn old man. So the idea that the whole Copernican and Galileo thing was the church trying to hold back science. It wasn't. They sponsored Copernicus. They encouraged him. They wanted to publish his book. And then with Galileo, that was, as I said, more about politics and theology than it was about science. And the church had the science of the day on its side. That changes that whole story. Aaron Ra knows nothing of any of that.
So this has been a fascinating dialogue. I'm curious what kind of terms you're on with Aaron Ra. Like, if I could organize a debate between the two of you guys, is there too much bad blood between you? I mean, I'm a pretty smooth talker sometimes. Maybe I could mend a fence or two if
people have tried to, but he's not interested. He has responded sort of. I saw some exchanges on Facebook where people were saying, hey, this guy's written this article that's basically ripped you a new one. What's your response? He picked out, he obviously didn't even read it. He picked out a couple of things that he quibbled over, which he was wrong about anyway. And they were minor points. So I don't think he's terribly interested. I really think he actually doesn't care about history. I think he actually just wants to use history as a kind of a quarry with which to dig out some nuggets of stuff to chuck at Christianity. There's a very good book that came out last year by a guy called Nathan Johnson, who's a historian. This is a peer-reviewed monograph. It's called The New Atheism, Myth and History. And it's basically talking about what I'm talking about. It's saying, unfortunately, the new atheism, the so-called anti-theistic atheists, don't use history in any kind of rational way. They use it in a polemical way, and they aren't actually interested in history. They just really just sort of take some bits and pieces. They don't check their facts, and they just use it to kind of throw it at Christianity. This is an excellent book, heavy reading, but I've got a detailed review of this on my blog as well. But these guys just don't care. They don't care about history. What they actually care about is getting the biggest stick with which to hit Christianity. It's the same with mythicism. The reason many people, and I've had them tell me this, the reason they like mythicism is that it's much more powerful for them to say to a Christian, Jesus didn't even exist, than it is to say Jesus wasn't what you claim he was. The real reason they like mythicism, when it comes down to it, is that for many of them, is that it's the biggest possible weapon that they can use against Christianity, which means that they're not coming at it from a rational place. They're coming at it from an emotional place. And that usually leads to bad outcomes.
Yeah, man, that's some sobering things to think about. I hope that you'll send me some links to some of the books that you've recommended here, and I can put them in the description. There's so many of those books seem very fascinating to me, and I think that I actually looked at a couple of them on Audible. The one about the scientific history, the claims of that are out of balance with that have been debunked. So, do you have anything?
Yeah, well, probably the one that I would also recommend just on that. This one's probably a bit more sort of easy reading and more for a wider popular audience. This is a book called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. It's a collection of fairly short, fairly accessible essays. And it was edited by a guy called Ronald L. Numbers, who's probably the leading historian of science working in the field today. This debunks lots of those common myths, like Christianity holding back science, Christianity teaching that the earth was flat, Galileo being imprisoned and tortured, which he wasn't, Copernicanism demoting humans from the center of the cosmos, which it didn't. So this is a great book. Interestingly, your my mutual friend Michael gave a copy of this to Aaron Ra at one of their debates, and he left it behind. He didn't want to read it.
You know, I think that might be the book that I think that might
Yeah.
be the book that I looked up, because I remember Michael telling that story on the live stream that he did with you.
Yeah.
I think that might have been why I looked it up. I was like, who's
It's a great
turning
book.
down a book? Jeez. A free
Yeah, I know.
book, at least you can put it on your bookshelf, even if you never read it, and you can say, oh yeah, well, I've seen the evidence against me. So do you want to promote anything before we end the stream?
Well, look, what I would say is there are counter arguments to everything that I've said, because this is history that we're talking about. So there are always counter arguments. So lots of people say, but Richard Carrier says, but such and such says. Sure. What I would say is pay attention to what the leading experts say. I'm not a leading expert, right? I'm just a dude with a hobby. I've got a history degree, but I don't have a PhD in history. I've got a master's in a related field, but not necessarily in history. But nothing that I'm saying here is my ideas, right? I'm not presenting any kind of radical new idea. I'm presenting mainstream consensus stuff. This is why I keep saying, have a look at these books. So don't pay attention to me. Pay attention to the people that I'm referring to. If you look at my blog, every single article I have links to books and articles all the way through. Pay attention to those. And just the final point is be very careful about confirmation bias. We are all inclined towards ideas that sort of fit with what we would like to believe. And one of the things that the study of history has taught me is stop, think, be skeptical. So if you like the idea that Jesus didn't exist, stop and think, is that really because I've carefully analysed the evidence? Or is it because I like that idea? And think, is there a reason why a very large number of historians and scholars who aren't Christians absolutely agree that there was a historical Jesus, and why the people who claim, the very few scholars who claim that he didn't, are largely people who have an anti-Christian axe to grind. That should ring an alarm bell for any of us. So don't take my word for it. Think for yourself.
Well, I like the idea that he was a fire and brimstone badass. So I kind of like what you had to say here. So I'll go ahead and leave it there. As always, leave us your thoughts in the comments below, and we will see you in the next video.